And we have lots and lots of flying vehicles outside, so we tried to create as many elements of those as possible. And each one we had to adjust the level of focus behind there, the depth of field, to relate to real life things.
Scott, tell them about the light blooming around the characters.
Well, that was the other thing with the overexposure. We wanted to get a light wrap effect around them. So we done some tests, photographic tests, and tried to reproduce the look there. So the light actually wraps around and creates that effect as if they're in front of a real bright background.
It's the subtlety in the shots that just makes it really real.
Plot-wise, we're dealing with the insistence of Obi-Wan taking on this young kid and training him, even though it's, in theory, the child should have been trained by Yoda until he was about 7 or 8 years old. And then when he was 7 or 8, he'd be given a Jedi. He'd become the Padawan learner to a Jedi. So here we're having Qui-Gon wanting to skip the early training and jump right to taking him on as his Padawan learner, which is controversial and ultimately the source of much of the problems that develop later on. That we added later. When I cut the film together and looked at it, I needed to set up something that explained where Padme was going to be during these next few scenes, because Padme disappears, because obviously Padme is the queen. So I needed to come up with some reason why we don't see Padme in this next series of scenes until we get back on the plane. Thematic issues here is how Palpatine becomes Chancellor, telling how he moved to the next level, and then when you see all of the films together, it'll all make a lot more sense. But this is kind of a very small thematic issue that transcends all 6 movies, as opposed to something that's actually neatly tied up in this particular movie. Although step 1 is that Palpatine becomes Chancellor, and you'll see in episode 2 that he then makes another step, and in episode 3 he makes another step. See, we really wanted to work on something that would show you that there are thousands and thousands of delegates into this government body, and that there would be some kind of unique way in which they were able to express themselves and carry on the government, but do it on a very grand scale, and came up with this sort of large stadium design with these little pods that move around inside it, which gives it a different look, but at the same time seems very functional and realistic, even though it's realistic.
Chamber represented a unique sound environment. The priority sound-wise was the dialogue, because what the characters are saying is very important to understand. The sounds of the pods had to be very subdued. Most of the sounds of the pods are made out of sounds I recorded in a refrigerator. The sounds of the motor turning on and off. So it's the motor's kind of muffled deep into the bowels of the refrigerator. They were echoed, and the different pods were pitched to slightly different sounds so they wouldn't all blend together as the same noise. Just enough articulation to keep it alive and natural, as if you're really there, without calling a lot of attention to itself.
Entire Senate sequence, some of the difficulty here was also dealing with the blue screen around the Queen's hair and little subtleties like that. When they go in front of the white glowing bars, we had to add all of that in and had to have that, once again, light wrap. And then all the cameras flying around are computer graphics.
Along blue screen people, we also put in some digital characters. If you look closely at the bottom of the screen, coming up, you're going to see the E.T. family in one of the pods. We also added some of the other pod racers into some of the shots. There's Gascano in one, there's Rats Tyrell in another one. So if you look closely down bottom left, those are the E.T.s down there.
The ETs are actually in a couple of shots. We put them in one shot, and George showed it to Stephen, and Stephen said, "Oh, they're not big enough," so George had us add them to another shot.
Primary issues between this relationship between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon is that this is establishing Obi-Wan as the kind of straight arrow, the center of the movie, and Qui-Gon as the rebel, as the one who's constantly sort of pushing the envelope, which will switch itself in the next movie when, rather than having his master be the rebel, he has his Padawan learner become the rebel. I'm using Obi-Wan as sort of the centering device through all these movies, even as we get in with Luke and everybody else later on.
We're back inside the Jedi Palace, and once again trying to keep the same look and same tone, trying to do the color balance on all the foreground characters and make sure that the digital matte painting matched into all of that, created the same look. We also had to pay attention to which direction the camera was shooting to match the lighting and the sun in its position as well.
Doing the next trilogy and starting off with Phantom Menace gave me a chance to introduce things that are only hinted at in the later movies, 4, 5, and 6, which is the Jedi Council. How does it operate? You get to see, rather than just one or two fallen Jedi or half-trained Jedi or exiled Jedi, you actually get to see the Jedi in full operation, their temple that they operate out of. This was a challenge to make this all concrete and real.
This is one of our very first matte paintings of Coruscant from Yusei, and it really is spectacular. I mean, it just shows the city in such exquisite detail.
So a lot of times we rendered quite a range of different ships flying in the background. And you can also see that we have the head and tail lights and engine lights on most of the ships. And so those were added in as well. So we would make up these long loops of ships flying and add those into the specific scenes as required.
This scene was originally shot as a sunset scene, but then George decided that with the Jedi Council scene being sunset, and then the two Jedi out on the balcony being sunset, and then this scene being sunset was just too much. So he decided afterwards that we were going to make this just after the sun is set. So the whole tone of the scene went from this very warm, fiery orange sunset color to this much cooler, bluer scene.
Begins to set up the relationship between the Gungans and the Queen. It's a setup for later on when she asks the Gungans for help. It's also moving along the plot of Palpatine becoming the Chancellor. And more importantly, it's the key scene where the Queen, rather than sitting passively by and watching all this stuff transpire, takes affirmative action and decides to go back to her planet and go back to her people. I've had this written several different ways, and at the same time I have several scenes that carry this idea further in terms of her, the conflict she's having between being passive and aggressive, and in terms of fighting and being peaceful. Because for her, it's a break of all of her principles to go back and fight. In this scene, she doesn't really intend to go back and fight, but she does intend to go back, which will lead to a fight, and she knows that. But she's still hoping that she can resolve it in some way that doesn't involve a war. Writing the script, and that I didn't want Anakin to become a Jedi yet, because I'm saving that for the end of the movie. But at the same time, I still had to have him tag along. And I was able to use really the device of the fact that Anakin had been put in Qui-Gon's care, and that he had promised his mother that he would take care of him, as a way of allowing them to take the boy along with him on this trek to the next third of the movie. One of the difficulties of writing a script with lots and lots of characters is you have to be able to rationalize why everybody is along. If you have a film like Dirty Dozen, where you sort of establish they're all going out on a mission together and you gather them all up and they go, it's pretty easy. But when you got a situation like this where there isn't any mandate that they stay together, that they're there for transitory reasons that are constantly having to be renewed as the plot progresses, it becomes much more difficult to be able to get all the characters in on the act and take them along on whatever journey you're going on.
Go to Blade Runner. There's 2 Blade Runner spinners in the traffic stream here, but they ended up being pretty small. We didn't want them to show up too clearly. You can just barely see them. Near the beginning of Blade Runner, there was a shot where we're approaching the big police station building, and there's a Millennium Falcon that was turned into a building and placed in the skyline. So there was a Star Wars homage in Blade Runner, and so we decided to return the compliment.
This sequence was one of the very first massive blue screen sets that we had. All that existed was the ramp and this platform. It was very tough for the actors this first week to understand where they were and what they were supposed to be doing, how they were supposed to be reacting to everything around them.
We also get a thing of what are midichlorians, how do they work, which advances a little bit of the story of the Force and how does the Force work and how do we come to know the Force, which is part of Anakin's training and learning to become a Jedi. We had to take the idea of the Force one step further. The midichlorians are kind of a side issue, not the sort of spiritual,